For the overwhelming majority of our existence on this planet, we lived without walls, without floors, without fire on demand or clean water, or any reliable distance between ourselves and the things that wanted to kill us. For roughly 300,000 years, before cities, before agriculture, before anything we would recognize as civilization, our ancestors existed in a state of raw, unmediated contact with a world that was indifferent to their survival, and they endured. But endurance is not the same as comfort. Endurance is not the same as health or safety or the quiet dignity we sometimes project backward onto people who hunted mammoths and painted caves. The popular imagination tends to romanticize the Paleolithic, the noble hunter, lean and capable, reading the landscape like a text, and the wise elder passing knowledge through firelit stories. These images are not entirely false, but they are profoundly incomplete. The reality of daily life for a Paleolithic human was defined by something much harder to romanticize: chronic pain, perpetual hunger, biological contamination, and a relationship with mortality so intimate that death was never more than a few days away. To understand who we are, we have to understand what we endured. And to understand what we endured, we have to look honestly at what the fossil record, the parasite evidence, and the anthropological data actually show us. What they show us is not what we expected. We should begin where every human experience begins, with the body itself. The skeleton is the only diary the Paleolithic left us, and it is not a flattering record. When paleoanthropologists examine the skeletal remains of hunter-gatherers from across the Pleistocene, certain patterns emerge with unsettling consistency. The bones tell of lives defined by mechanical stress so extreme that modern orthopedic surgeons would classify it as occupational damage, vertebral compression, degenerative joint disease in the hips and knees, enthesopathy, the calcification of tendons and ligaments at their attachment points, evidence of muscles working at or beyond their structural limits day after day, year after year. The teeth are perhaps the most revealing record of all. Not because of decay. Paradoxically, Paleolithic humans had less dental caries than agricultural populations who followed them, but because of wear. Extreme, grinding, catastrophic wear that exposed the pulp cavity and invited infection. This was not the wear of sugar or soft food. It was the wear of a tool. Our ancestors used their teeth to soften animal hides for clothing, to strip sinew from bone, to process plant fibers. The mouth was workshop as much as organ. By the time a Paleolithic human reached their 30s, if they reached their 30s, their teeth were worn to near flat stumps. Dental abscesses were nearly universal in older individuals. The pain was permanent and untreatable. Then there were the parasites. This is the detail that most comfortably seated modern viewers will find hardest to absorb. We were never alone in our bodies. The intestinal parasite load of a typical Paleolithic human was not an occasional occurrence or a rare misfortune. It was the baseline condition of being alive. Examination of preserved Paleolithic feces and the mummified remains of late Stone Age individuals has revealed species after species of roundworms, tapeworms, whipworms, and flukes living in a state of perpetual tenancy inside us. Otzi the Iceman, the extraordinarily preserved mummified hunter found in the Alps and dating to roughly 3,300 BCE, already late by Paleolithic standards, harbored evidence of at least 3 different intestinal parasites simultaneously, including Trichuris trichiura and the eggs of Ascaris lumbricoides, a roundworm that can grow to 30 centimeters in length and travels through the bloodstream before settling in the small intestine. He was also infested with lice. His clothing contained fleas. He was, by the standards of his time, presumably a healthy adult male. Skin parasites were a constant. Lice and mites colonized the hair and skin of virtually every member of every group. Botfly larvae burrowed under the skin of people living near suitable fly populations. External wound sites, and there were always wound sites, became vectors for secondary infestation. The body was a contested ecosystem, and the organisms competing for its resources were not always small. None of this was experienced as unusual. It was simply life. The itch was permanent. The worm was expected. The line between self and parasite was, in biological terms, not a line at all. The question of food dominates modern fantasies about the Paleolithic, more than almost any other. We have constructed entire dietary philosophies around the idea of what our ancestors ate: the lean proteins, the wild plants, the absence of processed carbohydrates. And some of this is directionally correct, but the essential reality of Paleolithic nutrition was not variety and abundance. It was profound, recurring, life-threatening scarcity interrupted by brief periods of surplus. A hunter-gatherer group of 20 to 50 individuals moved through a territory that could sustain them, barely, across multiple seasons. The hunting success rate for large game was not the heroic constant that cave paintings imply. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups, the closest living analogs to Paleolithic peoples, show that hunting expeditions return empty-handed more often than not. Among the Dai Kung San of the Kalahari, large game hunts succeed roughly 1 in 4 attempts. For Paleolithic hunters pursuing megafauna with stone-tipped spears and no projectile technology more sophisticated than an atlatl, the odds were similar or worse. The majority of calories, in most environments and most seasons, came not from dramatic hunts, but from the grinding, daily, exhausting work of gathering. Roots, tubers, seeds, berries, larvae, insects, and anything else that could be extracted from the landscape and processed into something edible. Insects deserve particular attention here, because modern squeamishness has caused us to undercount their dietary significance. Termites, grubs, beetle larvae, caterpillars, and grasshoppers were not emergency rations. They were reliable, calorie-dense, protein-rich food sources that required less energy to obtain than large game and were available across more seasons. Our discussed response to entomophagy is a recent cultural artifact. For most of our existence, the larva crawling through a rotting log was not repulsive. It was dinner. Even when large hunts succeeded, the aftermath was its own ordeal. A killed bison or mammoth had to be processed entirely on-site or transported in pieces, in the heat, with no preservation beyond drying and smoking, before it putrefied. Paleolithic humans consumed meat in stages of freshness that would constitute a public health emergency by modern standards. Food poisoning was not an unusual event. It was a recurring occupational hazard of eating. The processing of plant foods adds another layer of labor that modern abundance obscures entirely. Most edible wild roots and tubers require hours of work to extract from the ground with digging sticks, then further hours of pounding, soaking, or heating to neutralize the tannins and alkaloids that plants evolved specifically to deter consumption. The caloric return on this investment was real, but the energetic cost was immense. Women and children, who performed the majority of plant gathering in most documented hunter-gatherer societies, walked distances equivalent to half marathons on days when gathering was the primary activity, returning with loads of 30 to 40 kilograms that had to be processed before they could be eaten. The leisured forager living off the generosity of the land is a fiction built by people who have never actually foraged. And over all of this, over the gathering, the hunting, the insect eating, the borderline rotten meat, hung the constant shadow of famine. Not the managed scarcity of agricultural civilizations, where stockpiles could fail, but structures existed to respond, but absolute famine. The failure of a critical plant species, a drought that collapsed a waterhole, an unusually harsh winter that locked prey animals behind terrain that hunters could not follow. Under these conditions, people starved. Not metaphorically, they died. Children died first, then the elderly, then adults whose fat reserves had been exhausted over weeks of inadequate caloric intake. A bad season was not a hardship. It was a culling event. By evening, after a day of movement that could cover 15 to 20 kilometers of uneven terrain, our ancestors returned to shelter. And shelter, for most of the Paleolithic, was not a constructed dwelling. It was an overhang, a cave mouth, a windbreak of branches and hides, assembled and disassembled with each migration. Permanent structures are an agricultural invention. Paleolithic camps were temporary because the food supply was temporary. You left when the resources were depleted. You built again somewhere else. Sleeping on the ground is not the soft, romanticized version of earthen connection that wellness culture has made it. It is cold, hard, and infested. Ground-dwelling parasites, biting insects, fungal exposure from damp earth. In winter, in the environments that many Paleolithic groups inhabited, the periglacial steppes of Europe, the high-altitude plateaus of Central Asia. Sleeping outside without adequate insulation was a cause of death. Hypothermia in sleep is one of the most silent killers in the fossil record's narrative, visible not in bones but in absence. The people who did not survive to leave remains. Yet fire was the one technology that fundamentally altered the quality of rest. But fire inside an enclosed shelter, a cave, a skin tent, came with its own cost. Paleolithic humans spent the majority of their sleeping hours inhaling wood smoke at concentrations that modern occupational health standards would prohibit in any workplace. Analysis of skeletal remains shows sinus inflammation, respiratory damage, and the kind of chronic airway irritation consistent with years of heavy smoke exposure. The warmth that kept them alive was slowly damaging the tissue through which they breathed. There was no darkness like Paleolithic darkness. Modern humans live in environments so saturated with ambient light that genuine darkness, the darkness of a moonless night away from any fire, has become almost inaccessible to most of the world's population. For our ancestors, that darkness was every night. And in that darkness lived every predator that found humans worth hunting: cave lions, hyenas, leopards capable of carrying an adult human into a tree, wolves in pack configurations large enough to challenge a group of people defending themselves with fire and stone. The decision to let the fire die was not a passive one. It was a calculated risk taken against biological necessity when fuel was exhausted. The darkness that followed was not peaceful. It was vigilant. Violence between human groups is a subject that generates genuine scholarly disagreement, but the fossil evidence has resolved some of what was once open debate. Healed and unhealed fractures on Paleolithic skulls, the shape of blunt force trauma, the angle of penetrating wounds, the spatial clustering on the cranium that indicates repeated strikes from behind, tell a story of interpersonal violence that appears in populations across every continent and every era of the Stone Age. At Crow Creek in South Dakota, a mass grave dating to approximately 1325 CE, late by any reckoning but a useful window into pre-state violence, contained the remains of nearly 500 individuals, the majority bearing evidence of perimortem trauma. Scalping, decapitation, dismemberment. This was not an isolated incident. It was the end result of resource competition between groups competing for the same territory. For most of human prehistory, the band, the small mobile social unit of 20 to 50 related individuals, was the primary political structure, and bands competed over hunting grounds, over water sources, over the best seasonal migration routes, over mates. The archaeological record of Paleolithic Europe is scattered with evidence of ambush, groups of individuals killed in concentrated sites, the spatial evidence suggesting they were caught in a defensive position and overwhelmed. The rate of violent death in pre-state societies, across multiple independent analyses of skeletal data, hovers between 10 and 30% of all adult male deaths. This is not a number that suggests peaceful coexistence as a norm. Within groups, violence was also present, though it took a different form. Interpersonal disputes over resources, mates, or status left marks on bones that analysts have learned to read. But alongside the fractures and the unhealed wounds, the skeletal record also preserves something equally important: evidence of care, at individuals with severe congenital disabilities who lived into adulthood, broken limbs that were set and healed correctly, indicating deliberate medical intervention, elderly individuals whose advanced age made them nutritionally dependent on the group. These people survived because others fed them, carried them, and chose not to abandon them. The Paleolithic was not uniformly brutal. It was brutally selective about who received its generosity. Infection was the invisible predator. Every cut, every scrape, every thorn puncture in an era before antibiotics was a potential death sentence. The chain of events that modern medicine interrupts in hours: wound contamination, bacterial colonization, systemic infection, and sepsis, ran to completion with no intervention possible beyond rudimentary wound cleaning and the application of plants with antimicrobial properties. Some of these plants worked to varying degrees. Honey, certain molds, yarrow. The effectiveness was real but inconsistent. When an infection crossed from local to systemic, when the red line of spreading cellulitis climbed above the wound toward the core of the body, there was nothing to be done but wait and see whether the immune system, already taxed by parasites, nutritional stress, and chronic respiratory irritation, could mount a response fast enough. The bone record contains the evidence of what happened when it could not, as osteomyelitis, bacterial infection of the bone itself, appears in Paleolithic skeletal remains at rates that indicate it was a common endpoint of untreated wounds. The bone responds to infection by attempting to wall it off, laying down dense reactive tissue around the site, creating the characteristic lesions that analysts identify on excavated remains. These lesions mean the individual survived the acute phase of infection, but continued to carry it, chronically, for years. A slow-burning bone infection with no analgesic intervention in a person who still needed to walk 20 kilometers a day to eat. That was endurable. That was, by Paleolithic standards, a reasonable outcome. For women, childbirth was the most consistently dangerous experience of a Paleolithic life. And infant mortality in pre-agricultural and early agricultural populations runs between 30 and 50% of all live births in the first few years of life. The deaths cluster in the first weeks, the period of highest pathogen exposure, nutritional fragility, and immune vulnerability. But maternal mortality was also catastrophic by modern standards. Obstructed labor, postpartum hemorrhage, puerperal fever. These were not rare complications. They were common outcomes. A woman who successfully navigated 5 or 6 pregnancies to term was not typical. She was fortunate. Life expectancy at birth for Paleolithic populations is typically estimated in the mid to late 30s. This number is almost universally misunderstood. It does not mean that people were old at 35. It means that infant and child mortality was so extreme that it dragged the statistical average down toward ages that feel impossibly low. The individuals who survived childhood, who made it past the parasitic load of early infancy, past the nutritional crises of the weaning years, past the accident-prone years of early adulthood, could and did live into their 60s. Skeletal evidence from sites across the Old World confirms individuals of advanced age, but the path to that age required surviving a gauntlet that eliminated the majority of those who began it. There is a dimension of Paleolithic existence that bones cannot fully record, but that we should not ignore: the interior life, the cognitive weight of existing in a world that had not yet been explained. Lightning was not electrical discharge. It was agency, intention directed at you from somewhere beyond understanding. The darkness in which you slept was not merely cold and dangerous. It was populated with forces whose behavior could not be predicted or controlled. Disease arrived without visible cause and killed without apparent reason. The dead did not obviously go anywhere. They were simply there and then not there, and the boundary between those two states was incomprehensible. Ritual responses to this incomprehension appear in the archaeological record from very early dates. Red ochre on burials, ochre whose color resembles blood, whose use implies a belief that death required preparation for something beyond it. Grave goods, tools, food, jewelry interred with the dead in configurations that imply anticipated use. Cave art depicting animals with a precision and spatial intelligence that suggests not just observation, but meaning-making, the attempt to create a representational world that could be controlled when the real world could not. These are not the products of minds we would recognize as primitive. They are the products of minds exactly like ours, deployed against conditions we would find psychologically annihilating. The fear was not occasional. It was the ambient condition of consciousness in a world where every night brought genuine threat, every season brought potential famine, every wound carried the possibility of a slow death, and every human over the age of 30 carried the memory of everyone they had already lost. Grief was not a temporary state. It was structural. It was woven into the architecture of daily existence in ways that our managed, medicalized, socially buffered experience of mortality cannot fully replicate. And yet, we made it. Every single one of us reading this or listening to this is the direct biological descendant of people who survived all of it. Every parasite, every famine, every ambush, every infected wound, every winter, every birth that could have gone wrong and occasionally did. We carry in our genomes the record of 300 millennia of successful navigation through conditions that should have ended us many times over. What the Paleolithic offers us is not a model to return to. It is not a diet or a lifestyle or an aesthetic. It is a measure, a reminder of what the human organism was built for and what it was built from. The resilience that allowed our ancestors to continue, to bury their dead and keep moving, to absorb catastrophic losses and not collapse, to find something worth painting on a cave wall in the middle of an ice age. That resilience did not evaporate. It is still here. It was given to us. The next time you reach for clean water without thinking about it, understand that the absence of thought is the gift.